Good afternoon and welcome to MOCAD. Thank you all for coming out to this wonderful opening weekend of the Mobile Homestead and to the exhibition here at MOCAD. My name is Katie McGowan and I'm the Curator of Education here at the museum and will be working with my colleague John Brummett in the Mobile Homestead. As you know, we have a panel discussion today, but we're going to try to keep it fairly casual so we can include your questions, comments, and let the conversation flow organically. Thank you for everyone for coming and to our honored guests. On our panel today, we have Marsha Miro, MOCAD's founding director and board president, James Lingwood, the co-director of Artangel, and Mary-Clare Stevens, executive director of Mike Kelley Foundation for the Arts. So thank you for joining us today. To start off with, I wonder if, Marsha, you could give us a little bit of information about how the conversation began in getting Mobile Homestead built and brought to Detroit, to MOCAD, on our grounds.
I think it's okay. I'll just move closer to the...
This is trapped under the leg.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. Well, really the story begins with James and Mike. The MOCAD chapter began sort of after the hunt, when they came to visit us before we opened MOCAD. It was about a couple weeks before we opened. And we were installing a show called Meditations on an Emergency, which was curated by Klaus Curtis. And Mike and James were in town, and Mike called me up and said, "What are you doing?" He wanted to know what was going on here. And I sort of explained a little about MOCAD, that we were starting this museum, and he said, "Can I come over?" And I said, "Of course. Mike Kelley?" So Mike and James pulled up, and they had been looking around the city for a place for the Mobile Homestead, but they didn't tell me that right away. They came in and they looked around and they talked about what we were planning to do and wanted to know about the artists in the exhibit, and they looked at the space, and then they explained a little bit about the Mobile Homestead and that they had been looking for different sites for it, and that was the first time I had met James. And James will tell you this first part of that. And they were getting ready to leave, and we walked out behind the building, and I said, "Well, we have all this space behind here." And I mean, I had no idea what we would ever do with it, and I said, "Why don't you consider putting the Mobile Homestead behind MOCAD? Then we could take care of it and do programs with it and have a big opening where all these wonderful people would come, and we'd make Mary-Clare talk all the time." And so they said they'd think about it. And a short while later, I heard from Mike, or James, I don't remember which one, saying that they were very interested and we could begin talking about it. And the reason, and the rest continues on, the reason why I thought it would be great was obviously because Mike Kelley is such an important artist. He's a Detroiter, I mean, not Detroit, Catholic Detroit, I mean, not Detroit from growing up in Detroit, but from growing up around Detroit. And to me, he represents so much that was important in what was going on in the art world, but ideas and things that were born as in his youth, in his growing up in our community. And I felt it was really important for us to claim him, that he's known in the world as a Los Angeles artist and as being very important to that scene. But so much of his work comes from growing up in this area and from what he knew, and from University of Michigan, those kind of really rebellious years in the 70s when everything was in ferment, and Destroy All Monsters was born. So that was important for us to have him here, and to have him here in a significant way with a piece as important as the house was a dream. It was a gift to the city. It was a gift to all of us. And so the thought of being able to make this happen was exciting to me, important, and I hoped it would be significant to the community, and I think it will. So that's...
Thank you. Thank you. James, some of the people in this room may be uninitiated to the kind of projects that Artangel works on. Can you give us a brief introduction to Artangel and then explain how the conversation began with Mike Kelley?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in a nutshell, Artangel commissions and produces site-specific projects. So they will be, you know, often quite ambitious ideas which need to materialize in a particular place or building or situation. And that would be whether the work materializes as a kind of sculpture or installation, a sound piece, and also we work quite a lot with film and video, but quite often those films and videos are also very much related to a particular place or community. And we're producers in the sense that we start off with an idea, if you like. We then help or work with an artist to develop the script, so to speak, and then when we're at a particular that idea is evolved to a point where we think we can go into production, we're then negotiating with all the questions to do with site, with money, with you know, all of the kind of complexities that go into producing large-scale projects. I should say these are for the most part in London or sometimes elsewhere in the UK, and only very occasionally do we spread our wings to produce or co-produce projects outside of the UK. So this, our involvement with Mike Kelley and Mobile Homestead came about because Artangel, we made a decision that we would once in a while try and work with you know, artists whose need to make a project wouldn't lead them necessarily to do something in London or in England. And the first of these was a project with the American artist Ronnie Horn, which is sited in a small coastal village in the southwest of Iceland. It's called the Library of Water. And you might say, well, why Ronnie Horn in Iceland? Well, in a sense, Iceland was, or is, Ronnie's adoptive home. She calls the island her open-air studio, and it's been hugely formative for her as she's developed her, you know, her practice as an artist. So there was a compelling need that Ronnie had to make a project in Iceland, and it could only have been there. It wouldn't have made sense for Ronnie Horn to have made a library of water on the east coast of England, or not to the same extent, because she was working with glacial water from Iceland. And the same kind of compelling need came into our life when I began a conversation with Mike Kelley in, I think, 2005. And actually just rolling back a year or so before that, the reason that this conversation happened was because Artangel had produced a couple of films with the artist Cameron Jamie, also from Los Angeles, and a great friend of Mike's. And it transpired that Cameron wanted to make a film about spook houses, you know, in Detroit or in Michigan, and had spent some time planning it. And suddenly he sort of called me up and said, well, we're going to film in late October, and Mike Kelley is going to be the sound man. And so I didn't, you know, Cameron was not the sort of person who needed a producer sort of around and about. In fact, it would have been almost impossible. They were just jumping in cars, and when they heard about a kind of an interesting situation. And then after that, when we had been working with Cameron on editing the Spook House movie, he just suggested that somehow that Mike had some interesting ideas, which didn't come as a surprise. And when I went to visit him in Los Angeles, the idea of working with on a major project to do with his home in Detroit was already formed, and it had already he'd already attempted a first version of the project, which was simply to buy the home, the Kelley family home in Westland. And to his great disappointment, the person who lives in the house didn't want to sell it to him. And even more disappointing, Mike worked out that he was really quite healthy. So we'd have to wait quite some time. So he then began to, I think, sort of rethink the project conceptually in relation to its possible mobility, and using, I think, the model of Greenfield Village and the idea of these houses which had been transplanted from one place to another. So is that enough of an introduction?
Yeah, that's great, actually. Related to that, Mary-Clare, you worked with Mike for many years. I wonder if you could talk a little about how this project, in its current form, fits in or doesn't fit in with his larger body of work, or maybe a little bit about his perspective on how this project would relate to his latest body of work.
Well, let's see. He didn't talk. I worked with him in the studio since 2003, and he didn't go into great length about sort of the relationship between this project and others, but it was sort of known or implied that it's coming a lot from firstly work about, I think, about persona or biography. As you may all know, early on, Mike did a series called Half a Man with stuffed animals that were found and arranged. Beautiful work, and apparently the press picked it up and said, this artist must have been abused and molested, what's going on here? And really classic for the way Mike worked. He just took that and used it in the next body of work, and then began to really focus on this idea of repressed memory syndrome, which was really popular in the 80s. And out of that came a great work called Educational Complex, which is a model of every home, not every home, every institution that Mike attended, from St. Mary's here in Detroit up through Cal Arts, which is where he went to grad school. And in the model also, he included a model of his home out in Westland. So that's the first, site of learning and presumably trauma and repression. So I think it was inevitable that he would, continue to mine, as Marsha said, his connection to Detroit, his autobiography, as it were, or the sort of fiction of his biography. And he had been working the last 10 years basically on these extracurricular activity projective reconstruction videos, which were rituals, events, traumas that he, was projecting onto the educational complex. So all these videos, or the contents of these videos, happened somewhere in the educational complex. So he was quite excited, about this project, and using that as a source for videos for that continuing series, which he envisioned it as being 365 videos to represent one for every day of the year. And he really loved to play, I think, with that idea of the artist persona. There's a work called Pay for Your Pleasure, which talks about criminality and artistic practice, and and so this has those elements, I think, and so I think it's a big step, but he was also going bigger and bigger. He had a lot of big ideas, you know, and so it was really fortuitous that he met with James, because it does take a lot of support and funding to get some of these big ideas out in the world. So,
for any of you, this project is unique in that it is a sculpture that will be activated by the surrounding communities, rather than just either an edifice in which these activities take place or a sculpture. It's actually both, and I think it raises a lot of issues inherently about the public versus the private, in that the upper level is open to the public while the lower level will be used by Jim Shaw and Carrie Lauren and the artists that they have designated. Will not be a public space. And so clearly there's this this element of this relationship to the psyche and the private persona versus the public, but it also raises these issues related to public and private space and the institution. So now this mobile homestead is located on the grounds of a museum. I wonder if any of you have thoughts about this, the political implications of having the sculpture based on the grounds of a museum.
Well, I would just first say, as James indicated, Mike, the original idea for this had nothing to do with another institution, and it was really a private endeavor, an artwork for sure. But I think Mike became increasingly interested in the transformation of this project to deal with those issues. So, in a sense, he sort of ended up building it in to the process, as is, that really was where he excelled. I mean, he was very clear about what he wanted to do, but had a great flexibility in taking in new situations, new information, and then just sort of putting it through the Kelley mind and putting it out there again.
I mean, I think it's probably true to say that Mike had a kind of troubled or vexed relationship with authority.
Yes.
Or with kind of institutions of any kind. I think starting off with the family as an institution, and of course extending to kind of social, educational institutions, and then obviously art institutions too. And there was this quite conflicted relationship, I think, with the museum, went on in his work. So I think he had to kind of do quite a lot of questioning himself as to how this would sit in relationship to an institution. But I think two of the reasons which were quite persuasive to him, we talked about a little bit, was one that MOCAD was really a formative organization rather than one which was particularly formed or heavy. It had a kind of real sense of flexibility about it. And the second thing is that actually, even though the project is now in the grounds of MOCAD, it kind of faces to the street. And so it's kind of semi-detached, let's say, rather than absolutely part of MOCAD. And the third reason was really a pragmatic one, that this notion of the upper or the ground floor levels of the homestead being a flexible space for different kinds of community uses clearly needed to be activated by somebody like you and your team. So that kind of, rather than it being completely out, we looked originally, before we made the connection with MOCAD, at different lots in different parts of the suburbs, and it just seemed to both of us that it had the danger to become quite quickly quite inert, and that actually the relationship, this kind of semi-detached relationship to MOCAD, meant that it had much more of a possibility to have a kind of vital, energized community life. And only with that kind of vital, energized above ground life could the juxtaposition with the closed, private, ritualistic activities downstairs really come into play.
I think also, just from MOCAD's perspective, the idea of having another space with that mission, which is part of our mission, was really wonderful, because it's an intimate space, and this space is so cavernous, and could function really well as a part of the institution, but not really as part of the institution, and as a place that's not really about having an identity that's so closed, but one that is constantly open to what's happening next or what happened before. It fit well into our program. So I think it was kind of fortuitous in a way.
Yeah. One of the kind of Mike set some sort of conceptual framework to the activities he'd like to see taking place in the homestead. And one of the main criteria was not the kind of work which would habitually take place within MOCAD. So it was not an extension of the sort of educational activities or the kind of work with young artists that you might be doing here. It was actually to engage with very different kinds of communities.
Right, and that's a discussion we've had, for the last couple of years, talking about this project, about what is an appropriate activity to occur in the mobile homestead. And we've, after lots of discussion, realized that these activities are rooted in the desires of the communities that surround us versus the aesthetics of the people who work in the space. And so that identity will be completely separate from MOCAD's aesthetic or MOCAD's personality in that regard, where we're inviting community organizations and individuals who may or may not have a stake in the art world to participate and propose activities that go on to occur in the homestead. And so these activities can be anything, voter registration to AA meetings has become my line in the last couple of days, but basically encouraging community engagement that need not necessarily be art related.
I think what I just want to clarify about all this is that MOCAD was formed as an institution that isn't only about art in the traditional sense, but it was very important to us when we organized that we be involved in the community and do things in every way we could to help this community grow. And that was really the connection with the public level. And that's why the mission fits our mission. I mean, social art with social commitment, with political commitment, and art that isn't really so defined as art anymore is very important. And so that was always something that was as part of our program and part of our mission. So that's why it kind of fit. So we have Katie and John, really.
Yeah, so in this context of having MOCAD now having this, its first holding really, our first, as a non-collecting institution, our first piece, unwieldy as it is, how do you think, Marsha, how do you think that will affect or our activities inside, or how do you see the relationship between the future of the mobile homestead to the vis-a-vis the museum?
Well, we don't own it yet. I mean, hopefully in 5 years we will. And that means that we have to keep doing what we're doing right now and be true to the soul and mission of the homestead and of Mike Kelley. And so our hope is that will happen. Our belief is it will too. I think, the whole thing about museums having to own things or not owning things, I don't think is relevant. It just happens. We have this opportunity, so why not take it? And I just know that as time moves on, it will fit into the community in different ways as the city evolves. And I believe that all of us, all of you out there, will come up with ideas that will activate it and make it relevant. And that's what it's all about, whether we own it or not, or whether the state continues to own it. It's just continuing Mike's mission. And art shouldn't always be about possession. That's why, we didn't really start as a Kunsthal because we didn't want to own art. We started as an exhibition space because it wasn't important to us to own art. So I think that's sort of a difference.
I believe it was in Mike Kelley's 2010 Whitney Biennial essay, he mentioned something about his perspective on public art. Mary-Clare, can you speak to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think this piece is also a challenge to public art. It's a questioning, like most of Mike's work, which, he wasn't really about, let me make a work that, you sit with and it, you swallow it and it feels good. This is a real challenge to the, what's public art doing? Can it succeed? And also maybe even an investigation into the public's relationship with, art as a whole, that kind of relationship, because you'll have these so-called underground or secret activities going on below of a very select group or people on the outside, and in contrast to a space that's basically being left to the public. Mike often mused and built it in, if no one ends up using it, that's fine. If the windows get boarded up, well, that's what it is, And so in a bigger way, it serves as this sort of, almost as in a way, a symbolic gesture, as the start of a conversation about, maybe the stakes in art. What's the public stake? What are institutions' stake? What's the artist's stake in art? And how is it functioning? In the marketplace, in the community, et cetera.
Could I ask you a question, actually? And there are two aspects of the project which engage the communities here in a way which seems to me quite to constitute something of a turn in Mike's work. I mean, not only just creating these public, socially useful spaces, even if they were undermined by what lies beneath, sure, but also in the videos. Yeah. And the videos are quite surprising. Mike Kelley made a huge, sprawling kind of body of video work, both with sculptures and single screen. But this is very different because it involves the voices of people talking about their own experiences and themselves. I mean, did you think that this was really one of a kind, or did it signal a different sort of interest in his work going forward? Do you think these videos signal something significant in relation to the way he was beginning to think about his work?
He had done a documentary before, so I wasn't completely surprised, but I was somewhat surprised at just how straight they were, in a sense. And, I honestly think that's, Mike was an incredibly sensitive, thoughtful person on top of being a great artist, and I think, he realized, I just want, the community to speak. And the video was also, in Mike's frustration sometimes with the project and the years that went by, I think he really, he had put so much into this. He really wanted to make sure that there was, if the house never got built, that he definitely was going to have an artwork here that talked about his ideas for this piece. So that, I think, was a big, it was the impetus for starting that film. And then I think he discovered as he went along the way, some things he didn't expect. And as ever, he was wonderful at dealing with those and being open to it. And of course, Laura Sillers and Oren brought, something new. So, the one thing I was surprised about, this whole project has been much more collaborative, and he seemed to be very open to that. And, he was an artist that was very much about a very precise idea of his work. He wrote about his work. He curated. So in a sense, I did see that as a kind of a turn, an openness, a sort of more of a freedom, I think, to not have to control everything. So that was kind of cool.
I agree. I think that's one of the really interesting things about this project, where it is different from my understanding of his work as a whole, where it does allow, it's generous and it's open, and the idea of the artist letting go and allowing the community to essentially take over the space it's a really strong gesture. And I think it actually here it will be functioning beyond, when I first read about this project and began learning about it, I saw I saw some of these things as symbolic, you know, like the idea of the food drive from the 2010 launch. And it was an actual food drive, but it was a one-day sort of drop-off. And now, because it is a permanent installation, it can actually be more than, it can function in an actual way versus a symbolic one. So I imagine there's a lot of questions, and we have these great resources here. So if that's okay with you, we could open it up to these. Do people have questions?
Will the house always be in the same block or move this block here, or will it move around the city?
The question was whether the house will always be on that lot or whether it will move around the city. And the answer is a bit of both. Most of the house is fixed to that spot. There's this odd double-level basement, which is the public part, and then most of the above ground is fixed to that. But the front porch is actually mobile. So at least once a year, or depending on the kind of needs or the ideas that might come into view in Detroit, the front part of the house will be driven off to become the mobile homestead, dispensing social services along its way. So mainly here on that lot, but occasionally part of it will travel elsewhere.
Yeah, I just wanted to interject that going back to Greenfield Village, it thrilled and amused Mike to imagine the facade, or what we call the mobile portion of the home, sort of orbiting around the city of Detroit and around Greenfield Village, and then occasionally just parking in the parking lot, or running a needle exchange in the parking lot of Greenfield Village out of this facade. He loved that idea.
Interestingly, he never wanted actually to go into Greenfield Village, did he? He wanted to be just in the parking lot.
Yeah.
He described it as having kind of parasitical relationship to the Ford's idea of these homes of great Americans. And there was a sense that he could be kind of like in the proximity, almost haunting it, almost being slightly rejected by it.
Right.
So again,
it's like a guerrilla action,
yeah.
Just kind of zipping in and out.
Yeah.
I believe also, just to mention, I thought our first, maybe one of the first ideas for the annual trip of the mobile unit was, I think we were thinking about, it was related to libraries and a bookmobile. Early on, Mike really thought about, what kind of social services could this strange, facade carry out, and so he, bookmobile and a needle exchange and a bloodmobile. He obviously playing off of these mobiles that already existed. But I think the book, because of the situation in Detroit right now with the libraries, it's. I think we're all thinking that might be a nice first outing.
Yeah, when Mike was still around, we were discussing the bookmobile, and it was very much his input that informed our decision to make the house, or the front section of the house, a bookmobile for the first year. And so when we do the first journey, it will be, the mobile homestead will be filled with books, and we will stop at closed Detroit Public Library locations, which can draw some media attention to the lack of resources in those areas, as well as going to neighborhoods where we can actually, deliver more books to people who want them. There'll be a group, we have, obviously the museum will have a hand in determining when the bookmobile goes out or when the homestead goes out for logistical reasons, but these people here are actually have a lot of input in when the mobile homestead goes out and why.
I think our hope is it'll be responsive to the kind of needs and interests that are out there. So it will be for people in the community to kind of register their interest in this bookmobile, turning up in their community. So it should be responsive rather than too orchestrated.
Yeah, I think Mike would love, he started doing a lot of research into organizations, social organizations in the area. So I think he hoped and anticipated that some organizations would approach, we at first were going to approach them to see if they could utilize the mobile part. But it's my hope that, as the project settles here, that organizations who think that they may be able to utilize that mobile can approach MOCAD and start, talking about it. But as Katie said, logistically, it's not as easy to remove it from the house and get going. So for now, we're committed to one trip a year, but hopefully we'll see what happens.
Yes, sir.
It's
Yeah.
it's a thin slice at the front, a slice that will fit onto a trailer. That's
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's about
exactly.
8 feet wide by, I think, 30 feet long. And, basically, Mike had planned to make the whole house mobile, but as we did research into road regulations, et cetera, we found that you needed a permit to move a whole house, every time. And he thought that that would be prohibitive to, really utilizing it. So it was decided then to basically cut the house, and the widest you could go was 8 feet. So we chose a section of the house, and Mike felt that the facade, this portion you're seeing here, was really the most recognizable as a house. So basically, when you see that, your mind says, hey, there's a house going by. That's correct. That's the origination of the project. It is actually a replication of the home. It was measured back in 2006 and photo documented. He describes in his notes about his original ideas as purchasing the home, emptying it of its contents so it would serve as a community center, but presumably in the Westland neighborhood where it would remain in Westland, serve as a community center, and then he had planned to burrow tunnels to other neighbors randomly. That's what he says in his writing. So that, and then he moved to an idea. He was very open to ideas. He wanted to then maybe purchase a restaurant and put the home on the parking lot of a restaurant and burrow tunnels between the home and the restaurant and have a running restaurant with hot dogs and whatnot. So, and then it finally came to MOCAD.
Yeah, taking responsibility for a hot dog concession didn't really seem like the best way forward.
This is the house traveling. So the house did actually travel. If you have time, you should go into the video installation, which shows the documentation of the house transiting Michigan Avenue. The other portion of the house is constructed back here on the lot. So
This first part was constructed off-site and was then mounted on the trailer and traveled around Detroit, and particularly up and down Michigan Avenue through the summer of 2010. And then the rest of the house, as you see it today, was constructed on the lot there over began work last September.
So you can imagine that the engineering to bring these two pieces of architecture together was tricky. So it took some time to figure out. But if you go out there, and go into the house, you'll be able to see, you'll be able to see the seam, where it detaches. If you go into the front part of the house, you'll immediately see. Yeah, something like a zipper. Some metal plates.
Any questions? Anyone? Yes.
When the Mobile Homestead leaves, how do you protect the rest of the house? Because some of your house is gone. Like, it's just going to be open? Or is there...
No, there are shutters that get put up to make it weatherproof, and so you can still enter through a second front door.
Yeah, interestingly enough, it may almost have the appearance of, being boarded up, which of course ties into a lot of the sites you see around parts of Detroit.
That actually brings me to a closing question, I think, related to the boarded up houses surrounding, this new construction. Do you think Mike had, or did any of you discuss with Mike the relationship between building this new suburban, almost model home-esque house in a place that actually has a lot of homes that are being knocked down, or was he interested in that juxtaposition?
Yes, yes, definitely. I mean, it's really, you know, the video also, it's basically a journey from the inner city to the outlying metro areas or suburbs. You know, and if you look in the little exhibit outside the videos, he was very interested in the history of Detroit, in what used to be called white flight, which was the emptying out of the inner city. So in a very immediate way, it's, you know, bringing that suburb back into Detroit, and that maybe that mentality, that ideology, and, you know, transposing it here.
Yes.
Could be.
As Mike Kelley's
Rosebud. It's Rosebud.
Rosebud.
That very well could be. Generally, Mike didn't speak in those terms about it, but he did often tell very funny stories about traumatic events from his youth. One included a trip to the dentist, and another one, I think, involved kidnapping by a motorcycle gang. So, and sometimes we never, you know, you never knew if it was, you know, true or rooted in truth and fabricated, and, which again, I think was this sort of fluidity he had of playing with, you know, where he came from, and even just persona, you know, how one constructed, you know, their own personality, public persona versus private, etc.
I mean, there's no doubt that it's a very loaded idea. Yeah. The idea of either wanting to buy your family home back, or the idea of them wanting to reconstruct a version of it, a copy of it, but then strip it of any autobiographical reference. So his position on it was not kind of strictly autobiographical. It was just to do with the architectural frame of a home. I think that's true.
Yeah, well, he liked to play around with, you know, Freud. I don't think he believed in all of Freud's theories, but it reoccurs in his writings. So I think you could certainly look at it as a kind of, you know,
in a very axiomatic way, you know, it's conscious and subconscious, you know, sort of then going
Super
deeper
ego.
and deeper down. When Mike died, everyone closely involved in the development of the project, obviously we took a deep breath and decided not to make any hasty decisions. But after a few months, Artangel and MOCAD began to talk again with Mary-Clare and with the trustees of the Kelley Foundation. I think without really wanting to force the discussion at all, but to say, look, we need to talk about this and decide whether and how to continue. And there was actually kind of quite quickly a sort of, I think, a unanimity of desire that this is a project that could be continued, because in a sense it's an architectural project in terms of the construction had been designed, had been signed off, everything was in place, including the builders. So we felt that we could continue with that aspect of the project without actually having to do any interpretation. you know, it was all
Yeah.
set out?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, myself and some of the other people at the studios and some of the trustees of the estate, you know, we've had to consider a lot of this because, of course, we also continued with a retrospective that Mike had been working on prior to his death. This was relatively easy because so much was solid. Mike had already written about it. He'd been planning on showing the videos at the Whitney, so he and I had had a lot of discussions. I think without him, the biggest kind of issue has been, you know, no one knows what he would have done. I mean, my suspicion is Mike would have been more involved. He wanted to have a lot of exhibitions in the space, and I would imagine that he would have been very involved somewhat in facilitating those, you know, going out and sort of finding people or artists that he thought maybe were underrepresented or not seen. And then, of course, he planned to do work in the basement. And then, you know, we had a few discussions before he died about, you know, his vision for the basement and how that might operate. And frankly, you know, this was a very organic project, even though it was such a long time coming, that oftentimes the decisions don't get made until you're forced, you know, with the realities and the details. So, you know, he had talked with many people about ideas for things. So we all felt that we had, you know, the kernel, you know, of his wishes. And without him, you know, just trying to honor those, but not trying to sort of say this is what Mike would do, or, you know, I talked to him and I know, you know, anything like that. So, you know, I feel pretty confident in having worked with him for a long time that this could run, you know, and he sort of was already saying, you know, it's going to be what it's going to be in a way, and sort of letting go of it. So it seemed the perfect, you know, project in a way. At some point, he was going to remove himself from it because he didn't want to be heavily involved forever. So.
I don't understand his connection with Detroit.
He was born in Detroit. Yeah, I don't know what hospital, and he was raised in Westland. Well, I guess, you know, as a youth, he hung out here. He loved the music scene, and, you know, he grew up coming into the city, and that's my understanding, is that, you know, he was from here. He went to the University of Michigan for college, so his roots are here. I mean, I'm from Pennsylvania, so I'm not one to talk about the distinctions between, you know.
I think that's a good description. I mean, he's like many kids growing up in the suburbs who are alienated by their surroundings, and they go to the nearest big city, which in his case happened to be Detroit, and he fell in love with the culture here, and was, as a musician and an artist, this is the place that he found his people. Pardon me? I don't think the project is necessarily about his love for Detroit. I think it's about an exploration of, you know, it's his own work. It's his own body of work. I think he, as we all are, he's influenced by the places in which he grew up and learned. I don't think it claims to be about, you know, some kind of unbridled passion for Detroit. It's more about his wanting to reconnect with this general geography, originally in trying to buy the house in Westland, and then after that proved impossible, he explored other opportunities in the area.
He simply wanted the piece to be here. This was because that's his home.
His original house is in Westland, where he grew up for 18 years, so that was the start of the project. He originally thought he would do the project there and buy the actual house. But as it progressed, you know, he came upon the idea of transplanting the house because he couldn't buy it, and he felt that transplanting it into the city, in contrast, you know, the suburbs, which really is symbolic of, you know, more, you know, middle class, you know, generally a wealthier population, transplanting that somewhere else, you know, starts to another dialogue. But it's not necessarily about Detroit, the city. A lot of his work, you know, he was a musician. He talks a lot about being influenced by, you know, Detroit bands, the MC5, Stooges. So he loved Detroit, and he often looked back to it in terms of his own work. I'm not sure if that helps, but that's sort of my understanding.
I'm wondering, I'm not suggesting that the artist's message was anything as crude or as aggressive as a parody of the MOCAD, but in transporting the suburbs into the city, for the purposes of, an argument, I'm wondering if you think that he intended to prompt reflection on the MOCAD itself and what we're doing here.
Yeah, I'm sure that's part, I mean, it definitely was supposed to be a center that was really not about an institution. So, that alone may start prompting conversations and dialogues about, how can institutions really serve the community, and what, is art exclusive, all sorts of conversations, and I'm sure, those were part of his thinking.
Yeah, I think it's more about institutionality and the institution with a capital I than MOCAD specifically, but clearly his work often dealt with these issues of authority and institutionality and its successes and failures.
And that's, Katie and John have a program here in the museum that really also deals with some of those ideas of institutionality and museum in quotes.
So do we have one final question? Absolutely. And that's the exciting thing about this project for MOCAD, because in the museum we deal with, some of like social issues and political art, but it is through an institution. Out in the Mobile Homestead, it's a very different animal where we are directly inviting people and organizations to come to us, and we will facilitate their ideas. It is not a curated space, it's a public space. And to say that, of course, one could say, oh, well, there will be someone going through these programs and saying what can happen and what can't happen, but that will be largely determined by logistical concerns versus aesthetic concerns. So we can invite, like Jim Shaw was saying, like the Watercolor Society, as an example, like groups that may be art-related, but who are not necessarily the kind of work we show in the museum, as well as groups that have nothing to do with art per se. These examples of Mike's idea of the needle exchange or the bookmobile, those are not art world ideas. We also have, we've been talking about like an address that homeless people can use. Trying to think about like what are things that are missing, or what are things that people come to us and propose. And so we have created a brochure to hand out to people and to invite them to come to us with ideas, because it really won't be MOCAD pushing its ideas out onto the homestead. We are striving for it to be the community bringing their ideas to us.
Maybe you could start by taking contact details of people that are here.
Making what?
Taking contact details of people that are here.
Yeah, thank you. I think we definitely agree with you. Thank you.
We're done. Okay.